Okay, class, hello and welcome to our discussion of 10 Ways to Think About Writing, Section 4, Lost Money and Thank You Notes, or What's in an Audience. So Reed is going to start this off with an excellent sentence here. She has a lot of excellent sentences throughout this whole article, but I particularly like this one. Writing teachers are always going on and on about audience as if you didn't already know all about this concept. So she's going to claim you already know what audience is. And she's going to go on to say you already fully understand that when the audience changes, your message has to change, sometimes drastically. I think this is also very true. I think she's right on the money with this one. Y'all already know that who you're talking to matters, and you've already been doing this kind of thing your whole life. I actually think that's true of a lot of the concepts we cover in this class, not just audience, but like purpose, context, like all kinds of things. It's just that to me, the way I see it is that you've probably not thought about a lot of this stuff in an academic sense, in like a classroom setting sense before. Like maybe you have, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was the case. So a lot of things we cover, you already know this stuff. When we get to analysis, a lot of students struggle with analysis, but we've got some real world examples where it's like you do this thing all the time. And when we get to evaluation, you do this thing all the time. When we get to argument, you do this kind of stuff all the time. It's just the context is so different than the classroom context that sometimes that can be hard to see. And Reed's going to say that's true about audience. I think she is 100% correct. And she's going to give us a couple different thoughts. The thought experiment in this one, although it is a lot of fun to actually do in class, it might end up being one of our writing journals for the lab. But to start off, she's going to say, okay, I want you to imagine that you've done something embarrassingly stupid or impulsive that means you no longer have money to spend this semester. So I don't know what an 888 phone number is. This goes back to be careful not to include dated references in your writing. If I used to see stuff on television all the time with 800 numbers and things like that. Maybe it's something like that. Or the other thing is, if I don't know, I imagine kids coming right out of high school also have no idea what that involves. That's part of the composition process, deciding things to include, to not include, putting in your jokes, and then it turns out your jokes just fall flat. And as somebody who's very good at having jokes fall flat, I understand how painful that can be. But you've done something stupid, specifically that you've done something stupid. Like, for example, I've known someone who's like, okay, I don't have any more money left. I can't eat. I spent hundreds of dollars on Pokemon cards. Something that ridiculous. That's somebody I actually know that it's done that before. But in any case, whatever it is, you need money, and you can't get money back from whatever dumb thing you did. And this is Reed speaking, if Reed just said, write a message to try and get money from somebody, you might struggle a bit and then come up with some vague points about your situation. Because that's not really helpful. Who is someone? Someone could be anybody. And without knowing who that is, if you were specifically told write a message to try and get money from someone without being told any specifics about that audience, it's going to be a lot more difficult. But Reed claims here, if she says instead, ask your best friend for the money, suddenly you hopefully have a much clearer idea of the kinds of things you can say, because you know your best friend, you know the kinds of things that might work on them. That sounds a bit nefarious, like you're manipulating your best friend. You know the kinds of things that you can use to appeal to them. So, for example, you might say something like, remember how you owe me from that time I helped you last February? Or I'll pay you back. I'll do your laundry for a month. If you're living in a roommate situation, you can always bargain with chores. Just like, hey, I'm broke. Can I lean on you for some assistance? And usually, most students also say they would tell their friends the truth about what happened. And that's, would you do that too? If you did something absolutely stupid, would you actually tell your friends the truth? Because that's something else to consider. When you are writing to an audience, how open and honest are you about whatever it is going on? If you're talking to your best friend about some boneheaded decision you made, are you open and honest with them? And according to Reed, her students say a lot of the times, yeah, they're going to go ahead and be honest with their friend. Now, we're starting from this position of we don't even know who we're writing to. But if we say ask your best friend for the money, okay, we know exactly who we're writing to, and we know the kinds of things we're going to say. But, getting down to the next paragraph. Suppose that your friend is nearly as broke as you are, which, in this economy, absolutely, and you have to ask one of your parents or another family adult for money instead. Now, I hopefully, and you can see things change between, I'm going to ask my best friend for money versus, I'm going to ask my parents for money. Because often the way that we talk to our friends and that we talk to our parents is different. Now, I know there are some people out there who have excellent relationships with their parents where they can openly approach their parents with all kinds of things. Good on you. That's not everybody's experience. Especially, I think, in older generations, like perhaps where Reed is coming from. But the approach is probably going to change in any case. So you can go to your friend and be like, hey, you remember how you owe me from this thing I did? Even with good relationships with your parents, usually you can't just roll up to your mom and dad and be like, hey, you owe me, remember? And hope that like really plays out. On the other hand, there are ways you can talk to your parents or ways that you can appeal to them for compassion and assistance that don't really work on your friends. Like you can go to your parents and pretend that your impending starvation is going to remove you from this mortal coil. You could pull on your parents' heartstrings emotionally, maybe in ways that don't work with a friend. Or just like you can appeal to your parents being like, oh, I'm really trying for a quality education. Help me, mama, help me, papa, for I am starving, but I need the school books in order to succeed. And that kind of thing doesn't really work with friends sometimes. You can approach your parents from a much more playing on their emotions kind of angle in order to get the money you need because you bought too many Pokemon cards. And then finally, suppose your parents are also broke because it's 2023. Nobody's got any money. So you go to a bank to try and take out a loan. Consider the kinds of things you take a bank, or would tell a bank. Consider the kinds of things that a bank wants to know about in order to give you money in the first place. Like, for example, your friend, or maybe even your parents, would probably, if you were able to get money from them, well, probably mostly the parents in this case, would be inclined to maybe where it's like, oh, I don't have to pay them back. A bank is never going to accept something like that. A loan is something by definition that you are paying back. The sort of emotional, oh, but I am so hungry, mama, kind of thing you could tell your parents. Bank doesn't care. Bank will let you starve. Bank's not your friend. They don't care if they screwed you over in the past and you think they owe you now. Bank is gonna do what a bank's gonna do. They're basically just gonna be like, all right, what's your collateral? What's your income? What's your ability to pay us back? Other than that, we don't particularly care. But in all of these cases, the purpose is the same and the exact situation is the same. Too much money on Pokemon cards. I need money to not starve. Well, let me ask my friend. I say these kinds of things. Let me ask my parents. I say these kinds of things. Let me ask a bank. I say these kinds of things. And when we get to Unit 2 and start talking about rhetorical appeals, ethos, pathos, and logos, what you're going to see is that's exactly what these three things are. You're engaging with your friend because you're leaning on the... in Reed's examples, let me say it this way. In Reed's examples, you are engaging with your friend on the basis of your relationship with your friend. You're leaning on ethos. You're engaging with your parents, in this case, like pulling on their heartstrings. That's emotional. That's pathos. And the bank only wants the logos. They want the actual hard tack numbers of the situation. They don't particularly care about the other two. And so that is Reid's thought experiment 4. You already know that when you switch audiences, you have to switch the way you're talking, just fundamentally. For examples from myself, and this is just the difference between the way I talk on the playground and the way I talk at home, like when I'm a small child, like the way I just discuss things with my friends on the third grade playground. Very different than the way I spoke in the presence of my parents, or even sometimes in the presence of my siblings. So that is the first part of section 4, is this little thought experiment that just shows you, hey, imagine you had this one purpose and you're switching audiences. Do you see how the message has to change? And the kinds of things you write to a bank are very different than the kinds of things you say to a parent, which are also very likely different than the things you would say to a friend. Now also, the rest of this is going to be talking about primary and secondary audience, which doesn't come up too much in this class, but we're going to cover it anyway, just to make sure that we've covered our bases. So the thing about a primary audience is the primary audience is the person you're doing your writing to. So if, for example, I'm writing a note to my parents to get money, they are my primary audience. The secondary audience is anybody else who might see that. So in Reid's example, you imagine you're writing a thank you note to your grandmother. She's the primary audience. You write to her. But she, that grandmother, might go show that note. Oh, look at this lovely note my grandchild wrote me, to somebody else, her church friends, yoga group, whatever. All of those people are then secondary audiences. Or if she puts it on the fridge, anybody who walks by is a secondary audience. So you consider your primary audience, but it might be the case that you have to adjust for secondary audience as well, if you can even imagine who they might be. So in this example up here with the grandmother and the thank you note, part of it is maybe flawed. So if you don't know who your grandmother's going to show the thing to, and more importantly, you don't know anything about that secondary audience, if you don't know your grandma's neighbors, you can't possibly adjust to them. So if your secondary audience is vague to you, you end up in a situation like this one. Write a message to somebody, or write a message to your parents, but consider the other people they might show the message to. It's just people. They're just someone, but adjust to that. Well, much like it's difficult to complete a piece of writing without knowing who your primary audience is, it can also be difficult to adjust to your secondary audience if you don't know a darn thing about them. So this situation doesn't come up nearly as much. Now, obviously, there are some situations in which it does work. So, for example, if you grew up watching cartoons, say a SpongeBob SquarePants or something like that, and you were but a wee child of 6 and 7, somewhere therein, watching SpongeBob SquarePants, if you go watch a lot of these children's cartoons now as an adult, you will see there are jokes put in there that the kids aren't going to understand. And those jokes are for the adults. So the people who are creating these children's cartoons, they have their primary audience, the young children watching their show. But they know they have a secondary audience of the parents in the room who are also going to end up having to watch the show. And so they put things in there specifically just for the secondary audience, because they can really know who that secondary audience is. So especially if it's like our kids are, the kids for the show, they're 5 to 7. The adults who are raising these kids are probably late 20s, early 30s. What are those people like? We'll put in references to these things. You can really do something like that. In a lot of writing situations, you just kind of can't. But it is something to keep in mind that the person you're writing to might not end up being the only person who sees the piece of writing you're producing. For purposes of our classroom, you could think of in Unit 2 and 3, when your audience is for your paper, you're supposed to be writing to different audiences. What that means is, during peer review, when your peers are seeing it, they're going to end up being secondary audiences. But again, unless you know them very specifically and you can incorporate them into your writing, a lot of times you're not going to know who they are. So you can just make sure you target your primary audience to the best of your ability. One of the things that Reed is going to say down here is that if you don't know who you're writing to, if you genuinely have no idea, like if you are writing to an application to a board or something like that, you've never met any of these people, you can't find any research online that tells you anything about them, you're just writing, you're sending off something to a bunch of faceless individuals who are going to look at your piece of writing, and you're just kind of hoping for the best. It can help to imagine a target audience in order to try and hit the level of tone and detail, or try and match your purpose to the best of your ability. So if you find yourself in a situation where you don't know who you're writing to, you're not sure who your primary audience is, you kind of got to make something up. But making something up will be a lot better than if you just kind of roll with nothing about who are these people. So do keep that in mind as well. Is it can help you could still, even if you're not entirely certain who you're writing to, by trying to imagine something and target then that target audience. I'm writing to this contest. I'm going to imagine it's a board full of professionals who are very formal. And so I'm going to craft my appeal to sound like that. So that's also a thing you can do in case you're stuck. I don't know what to write because I don't know who I'm writing to. Make someone up. It's better than sitting there not knowing. And so that's really it for section 4. You already know about audience, Reed claims. I think that's true, and I think this thought experiment does a pretty decent job at demonstrating that. Secondary audiences exist unless you've got reason to think that you can target them or guess who they might be. They might just end up being sort of a hand-waved consideration. Well, I can't know who this paper's going to go to. Oh, well. Or if you don't know who you're writing to, it's better to come up with something specific rather than try and sit in this, just write to someone. And that's basically it. Just audience changes your message fundamentally. It always has this impact. So always try and narrow down who it's going to be to the best of your ability. Not just your primary audience, but also your secondary audience, if applicable. And that's Unit 4. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. But other than that, that's going to be it for this video. Have a nice night.